The wind never stopped blowing. It came down from the mountains and rolled across the plains with a sound like breathing, low, constant, and dry. It whistled through the gaps in the palisade, rattled the thin canvas of soldier tents, and coated every surface with dust. There were no trees for shelter, no shade, no rest, just wind and sun and silence, interrupted now and then by the sharp report of a hammer or the weary cough of a man too sick to stand. Fort Laramie had been built to protect travelers, but by the 1850s, it had become a place to survive, if you could. There was nothing soft about life on the American frontier, but there was something uniquely cruel about Fort Laramie. Tucked along the Laramie River in southeastern Wyoming, it had once been a fur trading post, primitive, dusty, and remote. By the time the U.S. Army took it over in 1849, the place had already seen its share of hardship. The Army renamed it Fort Laramie and set to work building it up. They called it a supply depot, a resting place for migrants along the Oregon, Mormon, and California trails, a buffer between settlers and plains tribes. But no matter what they called it, it was still just a cluster of rough buildings and cracked barracks surrounded by nothing. No trees, no farms, no comfort. Just the great emptiness of the high plains and the rising tension of a continent being carved up by force. Conditions at the fort were wretched from the beginning. By 1850, the garrison housed over 120 men, packed into crumbling log buildings and canvas tents. Supplies were limited and poorly managed. Food spoiled in the heat or froze solid in winter. Fresh vegetables were almost unheard of. Most meals consisted of coffee, hardtack, bacon, and beans, if there were beans. Water was drawn from the Laramie River, which ran low in summer and froze in winter. It was often muddy and full of algae. Sanitation was nearly non-existent. Latrines overflowed during rains. Rats and flies were constant companions. And as always, the wind blew dust into everything. Into the bread, into the blankets, into the mouths of sleeping men. Sickness followed naturally. In the summer, it was dysentery and typhoid, waterborne diseases that spread fast in close quarters. In the winter, it was frostbite and pneumonia. The hospital was little more than a log shack with thin walls and a dirt floor. One doctor and a handful of assistants tried to treat dozens of patients with limited medicine and fewer resources. Sometimes, soldiers died not from disease, but from sheer exposure. One private was found frozen to death in the outhouse. Another slipped while hauling water in an ice storm and broke his neck on the frozen ground. There were no stretchers. Men carried the dead to a plot near the fort's edge, buried them in shallow graves, and marked the spots with sticks or stones, if they marked them at all. The graveyard grew steadily. Morale crumbled with each passing month. There was little to do but drill, haul wood, patrol the perimeter, and wait. Alcohol was banned, but whiskey still made its way into camp. Soldiers distilled their own in secret, drinking foul-smelling liquor brewed from whatever they could find. Drunkenness was punished with lashings, confinement, or hard labor, but the cycle repeated. Boredom bred resentment. Resentment bred defiance. Fights broke out between enlisted men and officers. Desertion became common. Some tried to escape on foot, vanishing into the wilderness. A few made it to the next station. Most didn't. The Army punished deserters harshly. Public floggings were held on the parade ground. Stripped to the waist, the men were tied to a post while their fellow soldiers were ordered to administer the lashes. Blood soaked the dirt. Some screamed, others didn't. Tensions with native tribes were constant and growing. The fort was surrounded by the homelands of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. Treaties were signed, broken, renegotiated, and broken again. Migrant wagon trains flowed westward by the thousands, cutting through buffalo lands and violating agreements with every passing month. The tribes grew more frustrated. The army grew more defensive. Skirmishes flared, then quieted, then flared again. Fort Laramie was supposed to be a symbol of American presence, stability in the frontier. But it was neither stable nor strong. Supply lines were unreliable. Food ran out. Ammunition was sometimes rationed. During one harsh winter, the garrison had to slaughter their horses for meat. They burned fence posts and dismantled their own buildings for firewood. At night, some men claimed to hear war drums in the distance. Most heard nothing at all, just the wind, always the wind. Visitors wrote about the misery. Migrants passing through often camped nearby, hoping to trade or rest before pressing on. Some left accounts of what they saw: soldiers with hollow cheeks, coughing blood into rags, officers who barely left their quarters, a fort that smelled of rot and desperation. One traveler described Fort Laramie as a miserable, wind-blasted ruin inhabited by ghosts who didn't yet know they were dead. Women occasionally lived at the fort, wives of officers or laundresses attached to the company. They fared no better. Childbirth was dangerous. Infant mortality was high, and the winters were long. Some went mad. Others simply faded away. There was no church, no chapel, no school, just the fort, the sky, and the endless plains. By the mid-1850s, things had improved slightly. The Army added adobe buildings, better quarters, and a stone powder magazine. But the problems remained. The structure of military command meant that supply requests could take months. Letters sent home were lost or censored. Pay often arrived late, and the mental strain of isolation slowly ate away at the garrison. Some men began carving into the walls, names, dates, crude drawings. A few went off into the hills to trap or trade without permission. Others stared at the horizon and spoke to no one. When the weather turned, tempers flared. Knife fights broke out over insults, over whiskey, over nothing. One sergeant, sleep-deprived and sick with fever, wandered outside during a snowstorm and was found dead at sunrise, his face frozen in a grimace, his body half buried in a drift. But still, they stayed. Because the fort mattered. It was a link in the chain, a checkpoint on the long road west, a place where travelers could rest, if only briefly, before heading into mountains or deserts or worse. And for the Army, it was a foothold, one they couldn't afford to lose. The soldiers who lived and died at Fort Laramie weren't heroes in the traditional sense. They weren't fighting great battles or winning medals. Most were farm boys or laborers, immigrants or orphans. They served because they had to, or because they had nowhere else to go. And they endured, through wind and dust, through sickness and starvation, through orders that made no sense and winters that never seemed to end. They endured because that's what the frontier demanded. Today, Fort Laramie still stands, preserved now as a historic site. Its old walls have been restored, its parade ground cleared of weeds. Visitors can walk the same paths, stand in the barracks, look out over the Laramie River and imagine what it was like. But no photo, no plaque, no ranger-led tour can fully capture what it meant to live there. To wake up with frost on your blanket. To carry a dying man to a grave dug with frozen hands. To listen to the wind scrape across the earth and know it might never stop. Fort Laramie wasn't just a place. It was a test, and many did not pass. Thank you for listening to Deserted Trails. Subscribe for more forgotten stories from the old frontier.